Okay, here we are all the way up to World War One in our course, and I'd like to sort of encapsulate the ideas in these lectures with these two illustrations. The first on the left is a drawing of American soldiers encountering trench warfare in Europe for the first time in 1918, and there had been some versions of trench warfare in the Civil War, but of course, no one was alive for that by the time World War One arrived, and so this was a new thing for American soldiers. The other thing is that there's an awful lot going on in the country back home, and one of the most important things is the accomplishment of female suffrage for the most part in this period in 1919, 1920. 1919 and 1920 are two very, very important years in world history, and particularly in American history. And I'm choosing these two images particularly to put together because the one on the left, this drawing of soldiers, was in a series about American liberty, ideas of American liberty going abroad. And this is the one on the right is a picture of Liberty herself striding from the west to the east to bring suffrage to the benighted women in the benighted women and people in the east who didn't have the vote. Remember, I said last time that a lot of women in a lot of states and territories in the West granted the vote as early as 1870 in various ways and various sort of levels of participation. And for a lot of suffragists, the awakening, as this picture is called, was liberty coming from the West. The other reason I like this image, and I hate to go nerd out about it so much, is that it shows Lady Liberty striding, and in this case, striding very forcefully and pointing at the East, saying, you need to get your act together. You need to join the enlightened. Well, I'm bringing enlightenment to you, so listen up. And one of the things we tend to forget that's overlooked about the iconography of Lady Liberty is that she's always moving. She's always striding forward. Even the Statue of Liberty, although she looks like she's standing there with her torch held high in New York Harbor, she's actually striding forward. And someday I'll give a lecture on this. The importance of that is because the Statue of Liberty was originally about the abolition of slavery in the United States. And in fact, if you were to look at the feet of the Statue of Liberty, which almost no one does because you can't see it, you're looking up from the ground, you see that she's trotting on uh, uh, chains of enslavement. Okay, so it's about liberty busting the chains of enslavement and enlightening the rest of the world. So I always prefer pictures of that depict Lady Liberty in motion and in forward motion in progress. But in order to talk about World War One, I really have to go back a little bit to some of the things we talked about last week, which is the United States and 2 weeks ago, which was the United States and the world, the United States and the empire and his empire. And one way to look at this is to take a case study, and the case study I want to talk about is Panama. Okay, remember we talked about last time when I talked about the American Empire, I talked mainly about the West, and then of course overseas possessions take up from this um, Spanish American War in the Philippines and places like that. Well, there's an awful lot more going on in the Caribbean than just that, and in fact, it continues well into this period. Progressive era presidents, who expanded government power at home, also did so abroad. Now, initially, their interventions occurred in the Western Hemisphere, which the United States had made its sphere to oversee the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine says that European powers were not supposed to meddle in the Western Hemisphere anymore. But between 1901 and 1920, U.S. Marines landed in Caribbean countries more than 20 times. Usually to secure a better economic environment for American companies that wanted safe access to raw materials, especially sugar, or for bankers who wanted to ensure that loans to companies and even countries in the rest of the Americas were going to be repaid. So what remember I mentioned before I may have mentioned before when I was talking about Teddy Roosevelt. He sort of mentally divided the world into civilized and uncivilized nations. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt is president this time that I'm talking about, and he believed that the former, the civilized, were obliged to establish order in a chaotic world made up of uncivilized nations. Okay, Roosevelt was far more engaged in international diplomacy than his predecessors, and while he disclaimed any American interest in acquiring overseas territories, he ordered multiple interventions in Latin America. His first major action was engineering the separation of Panama from Colombia. Panama, which you know very well, is the sort of isthmus country that connects North America and South America. Well, that was all Colombia before, and Roosevelt did this in order to build a canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. 1903. Colombia refused to cede land for the canal, so Roosevelt helped launch an uprising in Panama, and he deployed American gunboats to prevent the Colombian army from suppressing it. Now, having secured Panamanian independence and a treaty giving the United States the right to construct and operate a canal and giving it also sovereignty over the Panama Canal Zone, Roosevelt launched one of the greatest, biggest, largest construction and engineering projects in history. I took the canal zone, is what he later exclaimed. Now, this project wasn't finished until 1914, but if you look at the map and you realize you're working on early 20th century technology, it is an amazing thing. And it facilitated American and world trade by drastically cutting shipping times, right? You didn't have to go around South America anymore, or you didn't have to unload your stuff in Central America, ship it across Central America, ship it across the land. Ship it across the land in Central America, and reload it onto new ships. Okay, but the thing is, one of the triumphant notions about American history of this period is that the Panama Canal Zone, the United States acquired that, and everything was fine. That remained a source of tension for a very, very, very long time, for almost the rest of the 20th century. President Carter initiated a process of handing the operation of the Canal Zone over to Panama, but in 1977, and I remember that being very, very, very controversial. It was seen as giving up American power and things like that. It was set in train to be a long, very gradual process, and the operation of the Canal Zone was finally handed over to Panama in the year 2000. So Roosevelt's interventionist foreign policy came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This policy expressed the right of the United States to exercise an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, not just prevent European intervention in the Americas, as the Monroe Doctrine had specified, but forcibly to intervene whenever it deemed necessary. Okay? Roosevelt feared lots of things. He feared that the financial instability in the Americas simply invited European powers to intervene whenever they felt like their investments in Central America and in South America were threatened. In 1904, Roosevelt invaded the Dominican Republic to ensure that its customs houses repaid debts to European and American investors. In 1906, he sent troops to Cuba to ensure stability after a disputed election. They stayed there, by the way, until 1909. And then Taft, after Roosevelt, sent Marines to Nicaragua to protect a government friendly to economic interests. But he emphasized economic investment and loans from banks rather than kind of direct military intervention as the best means to spread American influence. Now, this policy, Taft's policy, was dollar diplomacy, right? And it took shape in Taft's efforts to shape the economies of Honduras, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and even Liberia in Africa. Now, this is a map of the Panama Canal Zone. There had been lots of proposals to cut a canal or something across all different kinds of places, including Nicaragua, using partly Lake Nicaragua as a source of a large inland lake that could be part of a canal. But ultimately, Panama was the one chosen, and it took forever to build this thing. But as you see, and by the way, it's very complicated. A lot of series of locks and dams. But of course, it immediately, once it opened, it immediately changed shipping in transatlantic shipping. It became trans-Pacific shipping much more easily. Now, if we look at this map, you see the U.S. and in the Caribbean in between 1898, that's the Spanish-American War, and 1941, the start of World War II, for the Americans anyway. This you see just an enormous number of interventions. Almost every island in the Caribbean sees some American presence at one time. Almost every country, certainly in Central America, and even a lot of countries in northern South America, right, are visited by American military or diplomats during this period, during this 50-ish years, almost 50 years. Okay, I like this cartoon. Again, this is a cartoon in one of these magazines. This one was called Judge. The magazine was called Judge, and this is called The World's Constable, and it commented on Teddy Roosevelt's new diplomacy. This is January 14th, 1905. It shows Roosevelt as an impartial policeman holding in one hand the threat of force, that's his billy club, right? And in the other hand, the promise of the peaceful settlement of disputes. Okay, now this is where Roosevelt, you see, stands between the undisciplined non-white peoples of the world and the imperialist European powers of Europe and Japan. This is Roosevelt being the power broker between the civilized and the uncivilized nations. Okay, but now let's look at what happens when Wilson becomes president. Wilson was highly moralistic, and he brought with him a missionary zeal and really a sense of his own and a sense of America's righteousness to his foreign policy, right? First thing is he made William Jennings Bryan, who we've referred to at different times in this course, who was an anti-imperialist. He made him his Secretary of State. He repudiated dollar diplomacy, promised to respect Latin American independence and free it from economic domination. Sorry about the noise of the trucks in the background. I seem to live in the neighborhood that will not ever be quiet. But Wilson believed that the United States had a duty to instruct other nations in democracy. And we'll see this, by the way, especially in the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. He also believed that American exports and investments spread American political ideals. You see, for Wilson, American economic influence served a higher purpose than profit. And his belief made for more military interventions than any president before or since. He sent the Marines to Haiti in 1915, sent them to the Dominican Republic in 1916 to protect American financial interests, and they stayed there in Dominican Republic anyway until 1924, and they stayed in Haiti until 1934. Wilson's foreign policy really illustrates a lasting paradox in modern American history. Presidents speaking most about freedom were also likely to intervene the most in other nations' affairs. But the place where Wilson was most involved was Mexico. Okay, in 1911, a revolution led by Francisco Madero overthrew Porfirio Diaz's longstanding dictatorship. So in 1913, without Wilson's knowledge, but with the support of the U.S. ambassador and American companies controlling Mexico's oils and mines, the military commander Victoriano Huerta assassinated Madero and seized power. Wilson went nuts. He was outraged. He would not extend recognition and vowed to teach I'm using his quotes here, teach Latin Americans to, quote, elect good men. When civil war erupted and Wilson sent troops to Veracruz to prevent arms shipments, they were met as invaders and attacked by Mexican troops. In 1916, after Mexican troops led by Pancho Villa killed Americans in a New Mexican town close to the border, Wilson ordered 10,000 American troops to invade northern Mexico to apprehend Villa. Revolutionary chaos continued during the next few years, and Mexico provided a warning that it was potentially very difficult to use American power to control foreign policy. Wilson never learned this. Now, let me bring up some maps here. This shows the various colonial settlements and colonial possessions in 1900 of a number of different countries. Okay, and you notice that the Americans the Americans don't have a great landmass outside the continental United States, but they have lots of in possessions in smaller parts of the Caribbean, especially in smaller parts of the Western Hemisphere. And this is a 1915 postcard which portrays two soldiers, one American, one Mexican, at the border between the two countries. This was shortly before Woodrow Wilson ordered the American troops into Mexico, and the photo is intended to show a difference in the discipline between the two. You see the smart dressed, standing to attention American soldier on the left, and this much more slouched, sort of leaning Mexican soldier on the right. Okay, now how then does World War I, what was known at the time as the Great War, start? In June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, started a chain of events that engulfed Europe in the most devastating war frankly, the world had ever seen. This, by the way, all happens in Bosnia, but too much emphasis is placed on the actual assassination itself. You see, European nations that were engaged in the scramble for colonies had entered into a series of alliances that not only sought to balance the power in colonial possessions, but also military domination in Europe. Okay, and once the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, that was just a catalyst for this house of cards or these dominoes to start falling over. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia because of the alliance system. Britain, France, Russia, Japan declare war on Austria-Hungary. Actually declare war on the Central Powers, which are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey and much of the Middle East. After the initial German victories, by the way, the war starts out with a series of German victories, but it doesn't last very long. The war becomes mired in a long stalemate of bloody and indecisive battles. New technologies such as submarines, airplanes, machine guns, tanks, poison gas produced unprecedented slaughter. In the 5-month Battle of Verdun in 1916, now this is one of the very few times in history a battle has gone on for 5 months. Some 600,000 French and German soldiers died. 10 million soldiers and uncounted civilians died in the whole war. The Great War inflicted a blow on the optimism and self-confidence of Western civilization. And, philosophers and statesmen had long celebrated reason and progress, and these were Western things. Well, these Western things were showing up on the Western front as well as being killing machines. The war also shocked socialist and labor movements. Those had valued international working class solidarity over nationalism, but when the war broke out, they saw people retreating to their national identity more than their working class identity and joining in the war. Okay, so workers of different nations kill each other for their national governments, and it really shows one of the problems that socialists have, because the national identity is almost always a stronger pull factor getting people involved in anything than working class solidarity, international working class solidarity. Now, Americans were deeply divided by the war. Many Americans sided with Britain, associating it with liberty and democracy, and they associated Germany with repressive and autocratic government, but others, particularly German and Irish Americans, opposed supporting the British. Immigrants from Russia, especially Jews, also didn't want America to support Russia and its czar. And the despotic Russia's alliance with Britain and France made it hard to believe that the war was a conflict between democracy and autocracy. After all, the czar is the biggest autocrat in Europe. Lots of feminists, pacifists, social reformers believed peace was necessary for reform at home, and they opposed American involvement. Now, President Wilson, at first proclaimed U.S. Neutrality, but naval warfare disrupted American commerce and threatened America's neutral stance. So, in May 1915, when German submarines sank the British liner Lusitania, killing 1,200 passengers, including 124 Americans, Wilson protested extremely strongly, and Americans were outraged. So they don't enter the war after the sinking of the Lusitania, of course, but the support drifts away. Support where there had been support for Germany drifts away from Germany and towards the Allies. Okay. Advocates of preparedness for the war included Teddy Roosevelt, included businessmen with ties to Britain, America's greatest trading partner, and recipient of more than $2 billion in wartime loans from U.S. banks. So America and the American government, American banks had more invested in the Allies than they did in the Central powers. Okay. Wilson himself was also strongly pro-British and called Germany a natural enemy of liberty. And by the end of 1915, he ordered preparedness to begin. Okay, some pictures, but before I start talking about the pictures, I want to apologize for the air conditioner in the background. In addition to it being very hot here, the air conditioner masks the 8,000 lawnmowers and weed whackers going around my neighborhood. And this seems kind of strange to put this picture in here when talking about the beginnings of World War I, but I think it's important because we've talked so much about, technology, industrial revolution, and things like that. And this is a picture of Orville Wright, one of the Wright brothers who started the first powered flight in 1903. And then in 1909, in order to demonstrate that they'd figured this out even better, he circled the Statue of Liberty. Now, this is a picture of that. And then, by 1914, you were having planes sophisticated enough to engage in dogfights during the war. So this is an incredibly fast improvement in technology to be able to go from Kitty Hawk to the Western Front power, fights between the Red Baron and aces from the British and French Air Corps is astounding. This is a campaign truck for the 1916 presidential election. Okay. Now, again, campaigning had not been completely unknown. Campaigning with big posters and that sort of stuff had not been completely unknown until the 20th century. But like everything else, it becomes more accelerated and becomes more mobile, if you will, because of advances in automobiles. Now, notice that this is already a truck. This is a truck already by 1916, which can presumably go around the whole town hooting about voting for Wilson, and Wilson promising peace, prosperity, and preparedness. So it's another way that shows you how quickly these two things, the automobile and the airplane, developed. Okay, now let me get back to Wilson and the war. May 1916, it looked as if Wilson's preparedness policy seemed to have worked. The Germans suspended submarine warfare against non-combatants. That allowed Americans to trade and travel freely without requiring military action or American ships protecting convoys, right? He kept us out of war became Wilson's campaign slogan in the 1916 presidential election. The Republican Party was reunited. Remember, we had that brief period where Teddy Roosevelt formed the Progressive Party that split the Republican vote, and the candidate from the Republicans, Charles Evans Hughes, lost to Wilson only by a narrow margin. okay, including, by the way, the votes of women in the western states. And remember that Wilson wasn't exactly the heaviest supporter of women's suffrage. Okay, on January 22nd, 1917, keep the chronology in mind here because the clock is ticking, so to speak. Wilson called for, quote, peace without victory in Europe, and he expressed his vision of a world order including freedom of the seas, restrictions on armaments, and self-determination for all nations, large and small. Okay? But Germany soon resumed its submarine warfare against ships sailing to or from Great Britain and sank several American merchant ships, gambling that it could starve Britain into submission before the United States intervened militarily. Okay? And then the key, so you know, the American government is leaning towards war because of this resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Then in March, British spies made public something called the Zimmermann telegram, one of the probably the most famous telegram in American history. And it was a message from the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the Mexican government, right, asking the Mexican government to declare war against the U.S. And in return, Germany would make sure it regained the territory it had lost in the Mexican War. Okay, so that is proof that was proof that the Germans were already plotting to keep the United States out of the war, right? Or if it went into the war, it would have to worry about having Mexico fighting on its southern border. Not only that, okay, remember this 1916, 1917's time of revolutions, there's a revolt in Ireland, there's a revolution in Russia that deposed the Tsar and established a constitutional republic, and it made it seem plausible for Americans anyway that the United States would be fighting for democracy. Okay, the government that's set up in Russia immediately after deposing the Tsar is not the communist government. It's the first revolutionary government, and that's a constitutional republic. So it looked as if Europe might be ridding itself of dictatorships and ridding itself of monarchies and autocracies. Okay, so it now looked like the U.S. really could jump in and on the side of the Allies for a war to make the world safe for democracy. And so on April 2nd, that's what Wilson does. He asks Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, and only very few people voted against it. And again, so he used that phrase, making the world safe for democracy. Now, granted, one of the things that's always forgotten in U.S. history is the United States enters World War I technically in April 1917, but it really spends the rest of 1917 gearing up, right, and arming and building its armaments up and training troops and stuff. So the whole year of 1917 is taken up with the United States getting prepared. American troops don't arrive in Europe until the spring of 1918. Okay, so the United States actually, in terms of military, in terms of troops on the ground, is in the war for 6, 7, 8 months. Okay, and by the way, by the spring of 1918, the Communist Revolution, that's the second revolution in Russia, led by Lenin, led to the withdrawal of Russia from the war. Okay. Lenin also exposed secret treaties by which the Allies had agreed to divide conquered territory after the war, and this embarrassed Wilson. Okay. January 1918, Wilson reassured the public that the war was a righteous cause by issuing something he called the 14 Points. And these 14 points stated American war aims and provided his vision of a new international order. These 14 points included self-determination of nations, freedom of the seas, free trade, open diplomacy, the adjustment of colonial claims with the colonized, in other words, negotiations to make the colonies make colonies more a part of colonialized people more a part of the planning for their future, and the establishment of, quote, a general association of nations, end quote, to preserve peace. Okay. Wilson thought that this organization, which eventually becomes the League of Nations, would act like the kinds of commissions that the progressives had established in the United States for ensuring social harmony and protecting the weak. Wilson really believed that the League of Nations would work because it was a rational approach to world problems. We sit down, we talk, we work things out, we negotiate, we don't fight. Okay, we can all, and the sort of can't we all just get along situation. I know it's ironic that the United States doesn't join the League of Nations, but I'll talk about that later. Okay, so again, troops arrive in spring of 1918. By September, there were nearly 1 million troops in the field of battle on the European continent, and this really helps turn the tide of the war and pushes German forces into retreat, especially after the famous Meuse-Argonne campaign. The thing is, it's not so much the numbers of Americans, although there was a lot and it was very important. It was the freshness of the troops, okay, and the fact that they could replace exhausted British regiments and French regiments. Okay, so by the way, Meuse-Argonne killed 100,000 American soldiers and was one of the most significant deadly battles in American history. So Germans now were on the retreat. And on November 9th, the German Kaiser abdicated the throne. 2 days later, Germany sued for peace, famous November 11th. The guns stopped at the 11th hour of the 11th day and the 11th month. Okay, so although over 100,000 Americans had died, that only comprised 1% of the 10 million people killed in the war. Okay, so now some more pictures about the war. This is the American painter John Singer Sargent. He was commissioned by the British government to create a painting depicting World War I, and he was sent to the front lines in France. And the result is Gast, completed in 1919 after the war was over. And this is certainly not what the authorities had in mind. Sargent had been revolted by the carnage he'd witnessed, so he painted a line of soldiers, their eyes bandaged because of exposure to mustard gas, and they're being led off by a medic to receive treatment. Okay, and there are more wounded men in the foreground, and it wasn't exactly the triumphal sort of thing that the British government expected Sargent to paint. But more importantly for us and for culture in general, he was showing some of the agonies of war and the real tragedy of war. Okay, a lot of the tragedy of war. And he was one of a lot of artists and intellectuals who concluded essentially that the war had been a ghastly and very bloody mistake. Now here I am with my maps again, maps, stats, and popular culture. Okay, this shows the Western Front, and it shows that how the arrival of American troops in 1918 shifted the balance of power and made the Allied victory possible. Okay. Now, World War I was the first war in which soldiers were moved to battle fronts in motorized trucks. This is a photograph from 1918, and again, like the photograph I showed you before of the truck used by Wilson's campaigning, it is remarkable how quickly this sort of technology develops. Okay, horses almost immediately get replaced. Well, I shouldn't say that. Horses are still used in World War II because not all the roads were passable by these trucks. But it is amazing how many soldiers were moved to the front by trucks, and especially on the Allied side. Okay, because one of the things the Americans did was bring over tons and tons of American trucks and other type of military vehicles. Now, like I keep saying throughout this course, people are paying attention during these periods. So a social commentator, Randolph Byrne, wrote about the American intervention in the war. War is the health of the state. He saw the expansion of government power in war as a threat, right? Most progressives, on the other hand, saw it as an opportunity for reforming the country and spreading progressive values around the world. Virtually all progressives rallied behind Wilson in the war, including intellectuals like John Dewey, journalists like Walter Lippmann, and Samuel Gompers, the head of the president of the American Federation of Labor, just to name a few. Dewey, by the way, told progressives to recognize, quote, the social possibilities of the war. You see, the war created a national government with really unprecedented power and and it became an increased presence in American lives. Selective Service Act was passed in May of 1918. 24 million men had to register for the draft, and the Army grew from 120,000 to 5 million men. Okay, remember I said a million go over to fight in the battlefields, but of course you almost always have to have 4 times that much in support troops. Okay, and then were new federal agencies created to regulate industry, transportation, labor relations, agriculture. There was a War Industries Board, which oversaw all aspects of war production, from distributing raw materials to setting prices for manufactured goods, and it created standardized specifications for nearly everything. Remember, we talked early on about the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, regularizing railroad rates. Well, this is sort of like the culmination of that process. In this case, it's because of the war. Another example is the Railroad Administration, which controlled the nation's transportation. There was a fuel agency, which rationed coal and oil, and a food administration directed by Herbert Hoover, who'd become president later. And that helped farmers increase crop yields and promoted more efficient food production. Now, you have to remember, these agencies generally saw themselves as friends to business as much as the regulators of business. And they guaranteed government contracts a high rate of profit and encouraged cooperation among businesses by suspending antitrust laws during the war. Remember, the previous 20 years have been talking about the building up of these antitrust laws. Okay. The War Labor Board included representatives of government, industry, and the AFL, and instituted in some industries a minimum wage, an 8-hour workday, and protections for unions. Wages rose significantly in the war. Working conditions improved in many places, and union membership doubled. Okay? Corporate and income taxes soared. By 1918, the wealthiest Americans were paying 60% of their income in taxes, and millions of Americans purchased Liberty bonds. Liberty bonds were these bonds you would buy from the government in order to help fund the war effort, and then you get paid back with interest over time. Okay. Now, when peace came, this wartime state very quickly dissolved. But what had happened is it had momentarily given progressives hope that, the government could rationalize the economy and society for the sake of justice and national purpose. If it could do it for war, why not do it for society in general? Now, here's a picture. I like to say to students, an awful lot of things that we take for granted now and we think go back all the way to the Declaration of Independence days really started in the gearing up of propaganda for World War I. Okay, so here's, by the way, and all combatants issued propaganda posters. This is an American poster, part of a 1917 campaign to sell war bonds. And it depicts a militarized Statue of Liberty about to take a sword from a kneeling Boy Scout. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, USA bonds were war bonds that you bought, and it helped invest in the government in the war effort. Okay, here's a German poster, right, which is satirically entitled "We Are the Barbarians," and it refutes the charges of barbarism that had been hurled at the Germans by the Allies. Right, it showed that, for instance, Germany outstrips England and France in Nobel prizes. It outstrips England and France in provision for the elderly, for book publication, education, and literacy. So there were these kind of cultural wars being fought on the propaganda front as well. Now, convincing the public was an interesting thing. Now, it's very easy to say that everyone jumped on board, but they didn't. Okay, lots of Americans doubted whether the United States should intervene in a struggle between rival empires. Many outright opposed the war, American entry into the war. The IWW, remember them, the Industrial Workers of the World, they opposed the war. The Socialist Party opposed the war. And so in April 1917, in order to counteract anti-war sentiment, Wilson created the Committee on Public Information. This was a campaign to build support for the war, the CPI. Remember, for the rest of the 20th century, you're going to have to deal with these little three-letter acronyms for everything. The CPI enlisted academics, enlisted journalists, artists, advertisers to flood the nation with pro-war propaganda, from posters to movies. It trained and sent across the nation 75,000 4-minute, what some these guys call 4-minute men. There were these orators who were sent out to deliver brief and standardized talks, sometimes in immigrant languages, right, to audiences at schools and movie theaters. Before the movie would start, a 4-minute man would jump up and give a speech on the stage. Remember, movie theaters all had stages then because they were both cinemas and live performance theaters. He'd jump up on the stage, he'd give a quick 4-minute speech about buying Liberty bonds, tell people to buy Liberty bonds either as they're coming into the lobby or on their way out after the movie. Okay. This is significant. The federal government had never before had an agency dedicated to manipulating public opinion. Okay. And this set the pattern for future administrations. Very similar campaigns during World War II, during the Cold War, during conflicts in Iraq, right? For instance, now this is Douglas Fairbanks, who was one of the most celebrated movie stars of the era, addressing people in 1918 at a rally, urging people to buy Liberty bonds. Now, what you might not notice is that's a megaphone in his right hand, okay? Because of course he's speaking unamplified to a crowd. Douglas Fairbanks wasn't a 4-minute man. He was a Hollywood star who tried to, who was used in order to raise money for the war effort. Okay? And here's another poster that I like. This is a Navy recruiting poster from World War I. Okay, don't read American history, make it. Okay, it tells you, shows a guy who's of military age reading a newspaper, reading about things that are happening, and he's not part of it, and the Navy is convincing him to try to join in and help make the history. Now, let's not forget the women's movements, because going on at the same time is an intensification of the women's movement. The use of the words democracy and freedom as ideological weapons of war inevitably sparked demands for the expansion of democracy and freedom at home. By 1916, Wilson seemed to be sort of leaning towards endorsing women's suffrage, but the war threatened to splinter the women's suffrage movement. Okay, many people in the women's suffrage movement opposed American intervention. Even the first woman in Congress, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, voted against the U.S. entry into the war. But most suffrage leaders and most women supported and participated in war mobilization, selling bonds, organizing patriotic rallies, and working in war production. Okay. There was a new and more militant generation of women activists organized by the National Women's Party, and they pushed for suffrage with tactics that really scandalized the older women activists. And these tactics were like civil disobedience, demonstrations in front of the White House, one of the pictures I showed you last week, and led by Alice Paul. These tactics, coupled with wartime service, pressured the White House to eventually fully endorse women's suffrage. And in 1919, the 19th Amendment passes the Congress, but it's ratified in 1920. And what it did was it barred any state from using sex as qualification for suffrage. It was ratified in 1920. Now, the United States became the 27th country to allow women to vote. Okay, so it's not exactly in the vanguard. So in many ways, women's suffrage is a was a was, America was very late to that reform. The war also enhanced other women's reformers' campaigns, especially prohibition. Okay. And several factors finally helped secure the prohibition of the sale of liquor nationwide, which had to be a constitutional amendment. Some of these factors were employers' interest in a more disciplined workforce. It wasn't good in an industrial economy to have people show up hungover. Urban reformers who wanted to have more orderly cities and to dismantle the political machines that used saloons as their sort of recruiting places. And women reformers who wanted to protect wives and children from domestic abuse and from the squandering of men's wages on alcohol. Lots of native-born Protestants sought prohibition as a means to Americanize immigrants. Lots of European immigrants were seen as heavy users of alcohol. Italians, French, British, Irish, and that was seen as many women reformers, Protestant reformers, sought to claim that was an un-American way to behave. Okay, so the first thing they do is just like the women's suffrage movement, they first focused on state campaigns, in which they were successful in more than a dozen states. The other thing that happens is the war, because it's a war against Germany, kind of makes beer unpopular. Okay, there were efforts, it's not by the government, but not yet by the government, but efforts to demonize or to Germanize everything from beer to cabbage to all kinds of things, right? And all this eventually works. In December 1917, Congress passed the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of liquors, which took effect in 1920. Now, again, I want to show this, although I used this in the opening of the lecture. This 1915 cartoon showing the Western states had given women the right to vote, and liberty was striding eastward in order to liberate the women of the East, in order to show, liberate them and give them a suffrage. Okay, and that's again, this is called the Awakening, a very, very interesting and popular image at the time. This is a 1916 cartoon from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, one of the most powerful organizations ever in consumer organizations or pressure groups or whatever you want to call them in American history, certainly in 20th century American history. Hey, this is a 1916 cartoon from a WCTU publication, and it shows petitions for prohibition flooding into Congress. And the caption reads, "On to Washington, storm the Capitol for national constitutional reform." Okay. This is a map that shows how, again, a lot of this had happened at the state and local level first in the early years of the 20th century. Many states in the South and the West had banned the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. So there were some wet counties that allowed alcoholic beverages and dry counties that banned them. You can see the wet counties are green, the dry counties are yellow, and this helps bring prohibition to fruition with the 18th Amendment. Okay, notice that heavily Protestant areas, the Southeast and the West, are a lot of the states are completely dry. Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia looks completely dry. You know, this is an amazing thing, and a lot of the other states are mostly dry. So these are the two big reforms that happen in this period leading up to the war. And we'll talk more about other reforms and the rest of World War I as in the next lecture.